It begins not with the thunder of artillery, but with the quiet, insidious hiss of a man's own breath freezing in the air before him. A crystal cloud, a ghost of the life inside, hangs for a moment and then vanishes. This is the first betrayal. The air you need to live becomes a visible marker of the cold that is trying to kill you. For the German Lancer, the common soldier shivering on the endless Russian steppe in the winter of 1941, this was a new kind of enemy. One he could not shoot, one he could not outflank. An enemy that was everywhere, all at once. He would press his hand against the steel of his rifle, the Karabiner 98K, a marvel of German engineering. In the summer, it was a familiar weight, an extension of his will. Now the metal was a predator. It leached the warmth from his fingers through his thin wool gloves with a shocking vampiric speed. The slightest touch of bare skin would mean leaving a layer of himself fused to the weapon. The bolt, once slick and fast, was now sluggish, gummed up with lubricating oil that had thickened into a paste, the consistency of cold tar. His weapon, his shield against the Red Army, had become a clumsy, frozen club. This single intimate moment of failure, a man betrayed by his own breath, by the very tool of his trade, was not an isolated incident. It was a private catastrophe being repeated, multiplied, and magnified across a front that stretched for over 1,000 miles. It was a silent, personal horror story whispered simultaneously by 3 million men. 3 million. It is a number so large it loses meaning, becoming an abstract statistic of a distant war. But it was not a statistic. It was 3 million sets of eyes, squinting against the blinding white of the snow. 3 million pairs of lungs, burning with every frigid inhalation. 6 million hands, turning numb and useless inside inadequate gloves. 6 million feet, shod in hobnailed leather boots designed for marching through France, now freezing, blackening, and dying inside their leather coffins. This was the reality of Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union. It was meant to be the crowning achievement of the Blitzkrieg, a final, decisive stroke to win the war. Instead, it became the anvil upon which the German army was broken. And the hammer that fell was not the Red Army. Not at first. The hammer was the cold. It was a failure of imagination so profound, an act of hubris so vast, that it stands as one of the greatest logistical blunders in the history of warfare. To understand how this army of supposed supermen found itself freezing to death at the gates of Moscow, we must go back just 6 months to the dizzying, sun-drenched days of June 1941. The German Wehrmacht was the most powerful, most feared military machine on the planet. It had shattered Poland in weeks, conquered Norway and Denmark, and humiliated the combined might of France and Britain in a campaign of shocking speed and audacity. The world had watched in awe. The German soldiers themselves, products of a relentless propaganda machine, believed in their own invincibility. They saw themselves as warriors of a higher order, destined for a swift and glorious victory. When the order for Barbarossa came, it was greeted with an iron confidence. The Soviet Union, they were told, was a rotten structure. One good kick and the whole thing would come crashing down. Hitler himself predicted the campaign would be over in 3 months, 4 at the most, well before the first snows fell. Based on this fatal assumption, the entire logistical plan was built. The army that crossed the Soviet border on June 22nd was a summer army. The soldiers wore light field grey wool uniforms. They were equipped for a war of movement, of sun-baked roads and long days. Winter clothing, antifreeze, cold weather lubricants, skis, snowplows. These were deemed unnecessary luxuries for a campaign that would be concluded by autumn. The quartermasters planned for a victory parade in Red Square, not for the distribution of felt-lined boots and insulated parkas, and for a time their breathtaking arrogance seemed justified. The opening weeks of the invasion were a spectacle of destruction on a scale never before seen. German panzer divisions sliced through the unprepared Soviet lines, encircling entire armies. Hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers were captured in vast pockets at Minsk, at Smolensk, at Kiev. The Luftwaffe owned the sky. It seemed to be a repeat of the French campaign, but on a monstrously larger stage. The sheer distances were intoxicating. The horizon of the steppe seemed to stretch into infinity, a sea of grass and sunflowers to be conquered. Day after day the advance continued, grinding eastward under a relentless summer sun. The soldiers marched, sweated, and fought with the unshakable belief that Moscow was just over the next hill, that victory was a matter of weeks away. But the land itself was beginning to fight back in ways their strategists had not fully appreciated. The Soviet Union was not France. Its roads were not paved highways, but primitive dirt tracks. When the autumn rains began in October, a month earlier and far heavier than the Germans had anticipated, these tracks dissolved. The earth turned against them. The infamous Rasputitsa, the time without roads, had arrived. The rich black soil of Ukraine became a quagmire, a vast clinging bog of mud that swallowed trucks, horses, and men. The Blitzkrieg, the war of lightning speed, slowed to a crawl. A panzer division, which could cover 100 miles a day on a French road, was lucky to make 10 miles in Russia's mud. Supply columns, the lifeblood of the army, became hopelessly stuck, stretching back for hundreds of miles. Fuel, ammunition, and most critically, food, began to run short at the front. The soldiers, exhausted, perpetually soaked and caked in mud, felt the first gnawing doubts. This land did not yield easily. It was a living, breathing entity, and it was hostile. The mud was a warning. It was the first breath of the monster that was to come, and they, in their arrogance, did not heed it. They cursed the mud, but they still believed the first hard frost would solve their problems, solidifying the ground and allowing the advance to resume its lightning pace. They prayed for the cold. It was a prayer they would come to regret for the rest of their short lives. The prayer was answered. Slowly at first, then with a savage, crystalline finality, the temperature began to drop. The deep, grasping mud of the Rasputitsa stiffened, cracking like sun-baked clay. Within a week the ground was iron. The panzer commanders rejoiced. The advance could begin again. The engines coughed to life in the pre-dawn gloom, their exhaust pluming white in the air, and the tracks of Army Group Center began to grind once more toward Moscow. For a few brief days, it seemed their faith was rewarded. But the cold did not stop at freezing the mud. It kept falling. -10°C, then -20, then -30, a temperature for which the German language had no common frame of reference. The cold became an enemy in itself, an adversary more insidious and implacable than any Soviet division. And it was here, in the realm of simple physics and brutal arithmetic, that the German war machine began to shatter. The Wehrmacht was a magnificent instrument, but it was an instrument designed for a different war, on a different continent. It was engineered for temperate climates, for dense road networks, for short campaigns where logistical tails never stretched more than a few hundred miles. The heart of the Blitzkrieg, the Panzer, was a creature of Western Europe. Its engine, typically a gasoline-powered Maybach HL-120 in the Panzer III and IV, relied on lubricants and coolants rated for German winters, not the continental deep freeze of the Russian plain. Below -20°C, the engine oil thickened to the consistency of tar. Starting a tank in the morning was not a matter of turning a key. It was a grueling, hours-long ordeal. Crews had to build fires under the engine blocks, risking vehicle fires and air attack just to coax the frozen metal into life. The starter motors often failed, their batteries drained of power by the cold, forcing crews to use inertia starters, a massive hand-cranked flywheel system that required the full strength of several men. Ethylene glycol, the simple antifreeze that could have solved the problem of cracked engine blocks, was in critically short supply, having been deemed non-essential for a campaign expected to end in autumn. The very steel of the machines turned against them. German steel of the era, high in carbon but lacking the nickel and molybdenum alloys that grant flexibility at low temperatures, suffered from catastrophic brittle fracture. Below -40°C, a shell that might have harmlessly ricocheted off a Panzer's glacis plate in July could now shatter it like glass. Suspension arms, drive sprockets, and torsion bars, stressed by the frozen, uneven ground, would snap without warning. The narrow 38-centimeter wide tracks of the Panzer III and IV, perfectly adequate for the roads of France, gave them a high ground pressure. In the deep, powdery snow that followed the frost, they became helpless, digging themselves in, bogging down just as they had in the mud. The Soviet T-34, by contrast, with its wide 50-centimeter tracks, floated over the snow, a phantom of superior environmental design. But the failure of the fighting machines at the front was only the final symptom of a much deeper disease. The true collapse was happening hundreds of miles to the rear, along the fragile arteries of supply. The German logistical plan was predicated on the Reichsbahn, the state railway. The problem was that the Soviet rail system ran on a different gauge. German standard gauge was 1,435 millimeters. Soviet broad gauge was 1,520 millimeters. That 85 millimeter difference was the fatal gap in the entire Eastern campaign. Every single item, every bullet, every shell, every loaf of bread, every can of fuel had to be unloaded from German trains at transfer points like Brest-Litovsk or Warsaw and reloaded onto captured Soviet rolling stock, or the tracks themselves had to be physically relayed. This monumental task was undertaken by railway engineer battalions, working with hand tools in the deepening winter, their progress slowed to a crawl by partisan attacks and the sheer, exhausting cold. They were re-gauging thousands of kilometers of track, but they could never keep pace with the army's needs. The result was a catastrophic bottleneck. The German supply system required the delivery of approximately 30 supply trains per day to sustain a single army group in combat operations. By December 1941, Army Group Center was receiving on a good day fewer than 10. Mountains of supplies, winter coats, ammunition, spare parts, medical equipment, piled up at railheads in Minsk and Smolensk, frozen solid, hundreds of miles from the men who desperately needed them. From these railheads, the final leg of the journey fell to trucks and horses. The workhorse of the German army was the Opel Blitz truck, a robust and reliable vehicle, but over 80% of them were two-wheel drive. They were utterly useless in deep snow. The few four-wheel drive models were overworked to the point of destruction. Fuel itself became a logistical nightmare. A single panzer division in combat could consume over 50,000 gallons of gasoline a day. Just keeping the truck and tank engines idling to prevent them from freezing solid consumed an astronomical amount of fuel that was not being replaced. And then there was the most fundamental currency of war, the calorie. The German military calculated that a soldier in winter combat on the Eastern Front required a daily intake of at least 4,500 calories to maintain body heat and operational effectiveness. By late November, the average ration delivered to the frontline Lanza had fallen below 2,000 calories. By mid-December, it was often less than 1,500. The men were starving on their feet. The standard rations of hard bread and preserved sausage froze solid, forcing men to chop them apart with axes or thaw them over fires, which were themselves a luxury. Horses, the forgotten engine of the largely non-mechanized German infantry divisions, suffered even more. Over 1 million horses were used in Operation Barbarossa. Each required 20 pounds of fodder a day. With supply lines choked, the horses chewed on fences and bark, then weakened and died by the tens of thousands, their frozen corpses littering the roadsides, sometimes becoming a final desperate source of food for the soldiers. The engineering failure extended to the most basic level, the soldier's own equipment. He was a biological machine being pushed past every conceivable design limit. He was issued the standard M36 greatcoat, an elegant wool garment wholly inadequate for the Russian winter. It absorbed moisture, became incredibly heavy, and when frozen, offered no insulation, turning into a rigid cage of ice. The standard issue marching boots, the leather Marschstiefel, were death traps. They offered no insulation, and the hobnails efficiently conducted the cold from the frozen ground directly to the soldiers' feet, leading to an epidemic of frostbite that accounted for more casualties than combat in some sectors. The simple act of reloading a rifle became a mortal danger, as bare skin would instantly freeze to the cold steel of the weapon, tearing away flesh when removed. The lack of white camouflage meant the men in their field grey uniforms were perfect targets against the endless snow. The German High Command had not just failed to supply its army, it had failed to understand the fundamental nature of the environment in which it was sending 3 million men to fight and die. It was an error not of strategy, but of physics, an arrogance not of military might, but of engineering hubris. The monster was no longer just the mud or the cold. It was the entire unyielding reality of a continent that refused to be conquered by machines built for a gentler world. And so the great, unyielding reality of the East descended. It was a reality measured not in kilometers or strategic objectives, but in the simple, brutal calculus of human survival. For the individual Lanzer, the German infantryman, the war ceased to be about ideology or grand strategy. It shrank until it was no bigger than the space inside his own frozen greatcoat. It was a universe of shivering, of a gnawing emptiness in the gut, of the profound and terrifying silence that comes when you are out of ammunition. The High Command's engineering hubris did not bleed oil or fracture steel on a distant map. It bled life, slowly and agonizingly, from millions of men, one frozen breath at a time. For a young corporal named Günther, from a small village in Bavaria, the enemy was no longer the shadowy figures of the Red Army, but the toes inside his own boots. Days earlier, he had waded through a half-frozen stream during a desperate retreat. Now, the leather of his Marschstiefel was frozen as hard as iron, a perfect cast of his feet. He could no longer feel them. He would march, stumble, and fall with his comrades, but the connection to the ground beneath him was gone, replaced by a dull wooden thudding. At night, huddled with a dozen other men in a shallow dugout scraped from the frozen earth, he dared not take them off. He had seen what happened. He had seen a man crying with relief as he pulled his boots off by a fire, only to have several of his blackened, dead toes come off with them, left behind in the frozen sock like pebbles. So Günther kept his on, a prisoner in his own uniform, wondering if his feet were still his, or if they were now just lumps of dead meat he was forced to carry to his grave. Hunger was a constant companion, a wolf that gnawed at the lining of the stomach day and night. It drove men to acts of desperation that would have been unthinkable weeks before. A soldier in the 16th Panzer Division wrote in his diary of the day, they found a supply crate dropped by the Luftwaffe. The men fell upon it like animals, tearing it open with bayonets and frozen fingers, only to find it filled not with ammunition or food, but with thousands of copies of a propaganda leaflet. He described the look on the men's faces, a hollow despair that was worse than rage. That night they burned the leaflets for a few moments of pathetic warmth. The only thing Berlin could send them was empty words, which turned to ash in seconds, offering no heat and no hope. The real food was the horse. Men who had lovingly groomed their animals, who had spoken to them on the long march from Poland, were now forced to watch as the quartermaster put a pistol to the head of a skeletal beast, its eyes dull with starvation. They would then descend on the carcass with axes, hacking off frozen chunks of stringy, nutrient-poor meat, which they boiled in their helmets with melted snow, creating a greasy, foul-smelling broth that was, nevertheless, the most precious thing in the world. Then there was the silence. Not the peaceful silence of a winter's night, but the loaded, terrifying silence of a firefight, dying for lack of fuel. A machine gunner with the 7th Infantry Division found himself in a small, snow-swept village west of Moscow. His MG-34 set up in the window of a shattered cottage. The Soviet attack came at dawn. Waves of men in white camouflage, screaming, "Hurrah!" He fired in disciplined bursts, the gun chattering its deadly song. His loader fed the last belt of ammunition, 250 rounds. As the last cartridge ejected, the familiar rhythmic bark of his weapon was replaced by a hollow click. The silence from his own gun was louder than the entire battle. Across the snow, the waves of white figures kept coming. They knew. They could hear the isolated cracks of rifles, but the machine guns, the scythes of modern war, were falling silent one by one. The gunner looked at the glowing barrel of his weapon, a useless length of steel. He looked at his loader, a boy of 19 whose face was a mask of pale terror. He had a pistol with 8 rounds and a bayonet. He was facing a tide of men. In that moment, the entire logistical failure of the campaign was distilled into one man's hopeless, weaponless stand. His war of mechanics and machinery was over. It was now down to knives and teeth. For every man who died from a bullet, 2 more were lost to the cold. It was an enemy that never slept. It crept into your bones, leached the warmth from your blood, and whispered promises of sleep. To fall asleep in the snow was to die. Men would be assigned to shaking duty, their only task to walk a line of sentries and physically shake them, slap their faces, and scream at them to keep them from drifting into the fatal, warm embrace of hypothermia. One veteran recounted the story of his best friend, a man named Erich. They were on sentry duty together, back to back for what little warmth that offered. Erich had stopped talking. The veteran, exhausted to his core, simply assumed Erich was conserving energy. When their relief finally came, he turned and pushed his friend, telling him it was time to go, but Erich didn't move. He was frozen solid, standing upright, his rifle still clutched in his hands, his eyes open and staring into the endless blizzard. He had not fallen. He had simply been turned to a statue of ice, a monument to an army abandoned by its own leaders. This was the human cost, multiplied by hundreds of thousands. It was the soldier who tore strips from his own greatcoat to wrap his rifle's trigger group, just so he could fire without leaving his skin on the metal. It was the medic, his medical kit long since empty, who could do nothing for a man with a gangrenous wound but give him his own cigarette. It was the thousands of men who stumbled into makeshift field hospitals, which were little more than frozen barns, their feet and hands wrapped in paper bandages because the cloth ones had run out months ago. They would lie in the straw listening to the wind howl outside, waiting for a death that was not glorious or heroic, but slow, anonymous, and agonizingly cold. The grand vision of Operation Barbarossa, the swift, decisive armored thrust to the heart of the Soviet Union, had died somewhere in the autumn mud. Now its ghost was being pursued and consumed by the Russian winter, and the price was being paid by the ordinary men who were told they were supermen, only to discover they were just flesh and blood, and that flesh and blood could freeze. And so the question that had been whispered in the rear echelons, the one dismissed by the architects of this grand invasion, finally arrived at the front, carried on the frozen wind. It was not a question of tactics, or bravery, or even ideology. It was a question of physics. It was the question a single drop of water asks before it turns to ice. It was the question of how much cold a man or a machine can endure before it simply stops. The turning point of this war was not a general's brilliant maneuver, nor was it the storming of a key city. It was the quiet, cumulative failure of a million tiny, overlooked things. It was the German grease for their machine guns, a perfect lubricant for the fields of France, which became thick as frozen tar in the Russian cold, jamming the bolts solid. It was the oil in the Panzer engines, which congealed into a black sludge, refusing to yield to the starter motor's groan. It was the narrow-gauge railway tracks of the Soviet Union, which meant every single bullet, every single loaf of bread, had to be unloaded from one train and painstakingly reloaded onto another, a process that bled time and energy from a supply line already stretched to the breaking point. This was a war machine built for a sprint, and it had been forced into a marathon across the harshest terrain on Earth. Every piece of equipment, from the soldiers' hobnail boots that conducted the cold directly into their feet, to the delicate sights on their artillery pieces, which frosted over and became useless, was a testament to a fatal assumption, that this place could be conquered before it had a chance to fight back. But the land itself was fighting back. The Red Army, for all its early defeats, had an ally that could not be bombed, could not be encircled, and could not be broken. General Winter did not command armies, but it armed the very air. The Soviet soldiers, men born of this climate, wore the padded Telegraika jackets and the felt Valenki boots of their ancestors. Their weapons were crude, perhaps, but designed with loose tolerances, meant to function when caked in ice and mud. They were the native sons of this unforgiving earth, and as the invaders froze in their tracks, these men emerged from the blizzards like apparitions, their faces wrapped in rags, moving with a purpose the Germans had long since lost. The counterattack, when it came, was less a military operation and more a force of nature, a cleansing storm sweeping over an army that had already been defeated by its own arrogance. When the spring of 1942 finally broke the winter's grip, it brought with it not a sense of renewal, but of obscene revelation. The Great Thaw was a slow, agonizing act of archaeology. As the mountains of snow melted back into the earth, the true ledger of the winter was laid bare. It began with the horses, hundreds of thousands of them, frozen solid in their harnesses, their bodies emerging from the receding snowdrifts like strange, forgotten statues. Then came the men. They were everywhere. Huddled in shallow foxholes, curled up beneath the twisted skeletons of pine trees, lying in neat rows where a field hospital had been overrun. The land gave up its dead, and the scale of it was impossible to comprehend. But it wasn't just the bodies, it was the machinery. Entire divisions' worth of equipment sat silent and rusting in the mud. Tanks and armored cars had sunk to their turrets in the autumn mire and were then frozen in place, their cannons pointing mutely at the sky. Trucks, their tires rotted away, were parked in perfect columns along roads that had dissolved into impassable swamps. A river of steel, meant to flow to Moscow, had simply stopped and solidified. For decades to come, the earth would remember. Farmers driving their plows through the fields of Belarus and Western Russia would hear the sharp clang of steel on steel. The spring harvest was not just one of crops, but an iron harvest of shell casings, rusted rifle barrels, belt buckles stamped with a god and a fatherland, and the skeletal remains of men whose names were long forgotten. The forests, which had witnessed the silent, desperate struggle, held these secrets in their roots. A birch tree might grow up and around a discarded helmet, embracing it, making it part of the landscape. The land itself became the final, unsparing monument to the campaign. There were no grand arches or marble statues here. There were only the quiet, persistent scars in the soil, a story told not in words, but in decay and rust. This was the legacy of a war against geography, a reminder that a map is not the territory, and that lines drawn on paper mean nothing to the mud and the ice. In the end, the story of this catastrophe is a simple one. It is the story of men who believed in their own myth. They saw themselves as the inheritors of a modern, unstoppable power, a force of pure will that could bend the world to its design. They brought the most sophisticated tools of industrial warfare to bear on a land that was ancient, vast, and governed by rules far older than any nation or ideology. They believed they could conquer a continent, but they failed to bring the right kind of grease. They planned for the fall of a capital, but they did not plan for a temperature drop of 40 degrees. The 3 million men sent into that crucible were not ultimately betrayed by a lack of courage, but by a failure of imagination. Their leaders, in their towering hubris, could not imagine a force more powerful than their own tanks and planes. They could not imagine the sheer, crushing, elemental power of the cold. The war on the Eastern Front was not won or lost. It was endured by one side and not by the other. And the price of that failure is still written on the land, a quiet, frozen testament, whispering its lesson to any who will listen. That man is a visitor here, and the earth abides.